Welcome to Honest. We're recording this so that we could put it up. Here's Zetu. Fantastic. We're putting this up on our Institute website, so please note that it is being recorded. I want to welcome all of you to this week's discussion. Speaking to you, some of us from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, many of us from the unceded territory of the William Webb Ellis Cup. Sorry, it's a bad joke, but we are the champions of the rugby, and I'm going to remind everyone all the time that for the next 4 years we are the champions of the world. Welcome to today's discussion, which is about a book that I am very excited about, and a conversation between three people who I think are just among the smartest and most interesting on this topic. This week, we are featuring a book by Amanda Swarr, whose book did it come out this year or last year, Amanda? This year. It's Amanda's book, Envisioning African Intersex. It's like the timing of this is so wonderful, actually, although we didn't plan it to coincide. But this week, Caster Semenya is launching her memoir. And so it just feels like the universe, somehow everything's aligning to get us to talk about this wonderful book, which is in part about, based on the kind of experiences of people like Caster Semenya. Envisioning intersex in Africa is a topic that is path-breaking, breaking through pathways that Amanda has been breaking for some time. She is a professor of gender, women, and sexuality studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. And she began doing this work a long time ago with her book, Sex in Transition, which was a prize-winning book. It won the Sylvia Rivera Prize in Transgender Studies. She published in 2012. In that book and in Envisioning Anti-Sex, Amanda's looking at the deeply complex history of medicine in Africa and its implications in racialized power, in the establishment of knowledge in the service of a system of racism that deeply experienced in the daily lives of so many people. And she's coming at it by looking at a group that hadn't really had a huge amount of attention in the large history of medical science and racism. Amanda's brought into that conversation issues of trans and intersex, and enabled us to see forms of body that are beyond our binary thinking. And she does that also by drawing on another area in which she has a deep and long set of concerns, and that is feminist politics, both transnationally but also in South Africa. And Amanda is one of those scholars who has worked on these issues, not only as an academic, but in conversation with and learning from communities of activists inside South Africa. So very happy to feature this book. And welcome to Ottawa, as it were, Amanda. In conversation with Amanda today is our colleague, Anne Cvetkovich, professor in the Feminist Institute for Social Transformation, 3 floors down from me, whose work is very well known. We're very fortunate to have Anne here. Her landmark text, An Archive of Feelings, I think is one that people do know very well. published in 2003. The one that appealed more to me, maybe because I do work on politics, is Depression, a Public Feeling, from 2012. I think it really speaks to the role of affect in sort of an early intervention that brought affect into our thinking about politics. And honestly, and who is not depressed as a permanent condition, reading the news and engaging with each other. But Anne's work well known. And then I'm really also excited to welcome Jabulani Pereira, who is speaking to us from Pereira in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. Jabu is I first came to know of Jabu as a photographer, actually, and an artist. He moved on into activism, founding, well, before he even was an activist, was the Africa Program Coordinator for the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, and then founded IRANTI in 2012, which is an organization to help movement building in South Africa and across Africa for people who are trans, intersex, and gender non-conforming. And that's absolutely invaluable work in opening up public space, but also providing behind-the-scenes support. Because, as we all know, this is extremely risky work and needs huge amounts of care and support in the background to nurture and keep alive public interventions in these debates. So welcome to the three of you. We're going to begin with Amanda, who will talk to us about her book and her key arguments. Then we'll move to Jabu, who will give us his sort of reading of the book, and then Anne is going to be in conversation with both of them. I think mainly with Amanda, but probably also with Jabu, and we'll move from there. And then I'll open it up as usual to comments from the floor. So, Amanda, off you go.
Thank you so much. I want to start my comments today with gratitude. I'm really honored that Shireen invited me to be part of this series that I respect so much. I appreciate her scholarship and think of her as a role model in how to understand history. So I'm excited for the conversations that are planned for today. I also want to express my gratitude to the two discussants. I've known Anne for many years and have huge respect for her work and insights, and I'm grateful for her being here. And Jabu is an incredible leader, writer, artist, and activist who's spearheaded absolutely groundbreaking interventions in South Africa. So to say I greatly admire those who are leading today's discussion is kind of an understatement, but I wanted to start with my deep thanks for all three of them for taking the time to engage with this book. And I also want to thank Shika and Gabriel and Susarita, who work behind the scenes in organizing today's event. So let me start with a little background about envisioning African intersex and how I came to it. As most of you likely know, in 2009, South African track star Caster Semenya became the world champion in the 800 meter, but her eligibility to compete in women's sport was immediately questioned. For more than a decade, she's been forced to submit to experimental medical interrogations and treatments, as well as public scrutiny that garnered public attention. But while Semenya's treatment is significant and continuing international debates over her body are hailed as deciding who counts as a woman and a man, it is far from isolated. Since the 1600s, colonial travelers, scientists, and doctors have falsely claimed that so-called hermaphroditism and intersex are disproportionately common among Black South Africans. Countless studies in medical journals and books, film and television representations, and media repeat the assertion. This book debunks that false claim. Instead, I argue that colonial histories and scientific racism form the basis for all of contemporary intersex medicine. And I highlight the work of African intersex activists who expose the material effects of such medicine and challenge their own pathologization. My ideas about this book began with a seemingly obscure master's thesis written in 1970 by H.J. Grace, then a student of zoology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, entitled Intersex in 4 South African Racial Groups in Durban. The stated intention of Grace's thesis was to prove that intersex was inordinately common among Black South Africans. When I read about this thesis in medical literature as a graduate student in the 1990s, sitting in the National Library of South Africa, I was surprised at its longevity and the breadth of citations based on it. I wondered, how could a mere master's thesis that is decades old and makes such troubling declarations have such a strong impact? But when I closely analyzed the thesis itself, I was even more disconcerted to find that not only did the study become a critical source for the claim of racialized intersex, it proves the inverse, that intersex is not more common among Black South Africans. But remarkably, even Grace himself continued to make this false claim, and countless other unsubstantiated works became the basis for decades of this assertion. After coming across Grace's scholarship in the 1990s, I was haunted by his false claim of racialized intersex frequency and its clear grounding in racist histories of science and medicine. The 1990s also marked the inception of intersex activism. And while I was working with queer and trans activists in South Africa, I met anti-apartheid activist Sally Gross, who in 1999 was returning from exile to found the first intersex activist organization on the continent. Sally became a collaborator and friend, and when she passed away tragically in 2014, I knew I had to write about the violence and injustices that she fought against and that had haunted me. I traced the history of the claim of disproportionate Black intersex backward and forward, developing a trajectory of intersex medicine through to more recent decades of African intersex activism demanding equity. So Shireen had asked me to share a few of my key arguments to give folks who are with us today who haven't read the book a sense of the content. So I want to focus first on 2 concepts that animate the book in my comments, 2 strategies that kind of helped me to understand how assertions of race intersex became so deeply ingrained and accepted so widely in ways that continue to the present. The first way that these false claims seeped into public consciousness is through what I refer to in the book as citational chains. Citational chains are references that build on each other to create truth claims of in spite of the fundamentally flawed foundations of the original work cited. These chains include bibliographical citations of publications, but they also reference ideas, fabricated observations by colonial explorers, and scientists' claims about Africans' bodies are replicated in the citational chains that span centuries. Grace's thesis chain that I just described is but one link in the citational chain of false assertions, repeated until they become accepted as fact. The second strategy that I identify as propelling racism and violence against intersex people is what I refer to as objectifying scrutiny. What it means to see is really fundamental to fusing race and intersex. Intersex medicine relies on exploitative medical photography and other kind of imaging that provides support for unsubstantiated data of citational chains. In my work, I found that images that are part of this scrutiny are not just confined to the pages of medical journals, instead moving in and out of popular culture. They enter public consciousness through their use in films and television and online as well. They're ripped from books for individual consumptions, and they're manipulated and represented in museums and published in textbooks that circulate for decades. I was also asked to share a little bit about my process and methodologies. So let me first say that many of my methodological choices were decisions about what not to do. I write extensively about and describe photographs, especially in medical contexts, but I do not reproduce them in this book. Cognizant of the violence of the photographs I discuss, I wanted to put doctors under the scrutiny that they focused on intersex patients in the photos. I also wanted to confront discussions and representations of intersex that are met with voyeuristic fascination. For these reasons, Envisioning African Intersex is a book centrally about images, but I refuse to include the images under consideration, and that's my attempt to create an intentional absence and a break in the citational chain. Let me share a little more about my process. So this book is grounded, as Shireen said, in my research and activism in South Africa over the past 25 years, and queer African scholarship is integral to my methodology. This work follows the recommendations of scholars including Zetu Matabene and Kigoro Macharia, who urge us to interrogate colonial archives of sexuality and gender as subjects of inquiry rather than sources of them. I aim to trace alternate histories, refusing the so-called discovery of intersex patients and the fetishization at the center of science, instead exposing doctors and scientists' racialized practices of gendering. Toward this end, this book draws on a very wide complex of materials, and I'll list a few of those. Colonial archival documents, a range of scientific and medical literature that spans over a century, films on intersex in African contexts, materials from the Galaqueer archive at WITS, life histories and interviews that I collected from 1997 until the present, participant observation in organizations, LGBTQI organizations, lots of media, and also online sources of information that were super useful, including websites of organization, YouTube videos like by organizations, including IRANTI, and social media posts. So I organized the book in two sections. The first half of the book is more historical, analyzing colonial representations and violent racist treatments of South Africans deemed intersex. And I call this section Uncovering Colonial and Apartheid Legacies. And then the second half of the book is what I want to turn to for the remainder of my time today, kind of introducing you to the book. And this section of the book is really focused on chapters that are primarily about activism. I labeled this section Recovering Decolonial Intersex Interventions. So I thought I'd give you a window into some of the latter chapters of the book with a focus on two of my own political motivations for writing this book now. And one of the reasons that this book gained urgency for me is due to the overt racism of so-called sex testing in sport and its violent effects. So for close to a century, sporting regulators and scientists have been trying to find a way to define what it is to be a woman. A range of policies and tests have sequentially been employed by those who have tried to measure and quantify sex. They have at different times focused on, and these kind of have spanned different decades, focused on genitals or chromosomes or genes or hormones, but all of these testing methods have failed miserably. What's more, and what's the focus of my work, is that this testing is racist, both in its targets and in its methods. So in chapter 4, I interrogate the scientific studies that are the basis for decisions about the boundaries of womanhood in elite sport. I show that these studies both rely on a kind of pseudoscience and reference decades-old medical literature, forming the latest link in the citational chains that I described a few minutes ago. Examples of these include studies published, sponsored by elite sport governing body World Athletics that describe its violent, unnecessary medical treatments of athletes, and shoddy research that's used as evidence for decisions about which women to exclude from sport. So in this chapter, I also engage with activists who are responding to this work and supporting Caster Semenya, especially on social media. Let me turn to the second related motivation for this book that I want to talk about, and this falls under the rubric of intersex activist interventions. For about 25 years, South African activists have been reframing gender binaries, and their work demonstrates underappreciated leadership and theorizations. One of the most notable activists in this kind of category was Sally Gross, who first founded the first intersex organization on the African continent, Intersex South Africa. As I already mentioned, Sally's death was a catalyst for writing this book, so I wanted to focus a chapter on her theorizations of intersex pathology and the way that she worked to reframe thinking about intersex. In the book's third chapter, my interviews with Gross from 2000 to 2014 and her own diverse writings and film works are woven together to articulate how she shifted public opinion about intersex science and its colonial roots. Sally mounted strong critiques of approaches such as teratology, the branch of medicine that deemed intersex people monstrous, and critiques of prominent scientists and doctors who insisted on so-called corrective procedures. Sally called out the damage of these ideologies and related practices and what this kind of damage did in South Africa. She asserted strongly that intersex people are normal and that non-consensual medical interventions should be prohibited. Sally was also the driving force, or one of the driving forces, I should say, behind legal transformations with global impact. The Equality Act of 2005, for example, became the first intersex inclusion in national anti-discrimination law, and South Africa's constitution became the first intersex inclusive constitution in the world. One of the other ways that Sally challenged intersex medicine was by reframing the photographs that I already discussed. An example that I explore in the book that demonstrates the concepts of citational chains and scrutiny focuses on the 2003 documentary, The Third Sex. This film was initially shown on South African television as a three-part series. And in it, Black and white patient photographs from medical journals, including those I mentioned, form a startling backdrop to a scathing critique of doctors' protocols. Unlike in their initial objectifying contexts, these photos are intentionally blurred by the movement of the filmmaker's camera as it zooms in to focus on patients' faces. They seem to stare back at the camera and prevent the viewer from scrutinizing their bodies. Sally played a key role in making this film, and interviews with doctors and these photos are juxtaposed with her theories and experiences narrated in her own voice and with her images, which effectively reverses the objectifying scientific gaze. Sally was one of a growing number of activists who've reclaimed the terms of public discourse and visual representations. In the past decade, over a decade actually, campaigns with a focus on normalizing and demedicalizing intersex have been spearheaded by organizations including Intersex South Africa and IRANTI, the amazing group that Jabu founded that uses visual mediums to destabilize discrimination. And in a moment, I'll defer to Jabu, who can speak much more eloquently about the decisions and details about this activism than I can. The final chapter of Envisioning African Intersex offers just a slice of this critical work. I highlight campaigns that combine education with personal stories, reclaiming intersex self-representations with striking effects through social media, vlogs, and television interviews, as well as workshops and direct actions. I also explore activists' own analyses of ways of seeing, exposing invisibility, hypervisibility, and violent medical scrutiny. Activists are engaging in collective and collaborative work in South Africa and that spans many African countries. They're calling for an end to non-consensual surgeries, training for healthcare providers, and a halt to bodily violence that's targeting intersex people. They're demanding accountability and acknowledgement of, in their words, suffering and injustice caused to intersex people. As I conclude, I'm reflecting on something that Sally said to me in 2000 when we first met. She told me that she was battening down for a long haul as seeds that she had sown in founding Intersex South Africa needed to, as she put it then, germinate and grow. Growing seeds have been nurtured over the past 2 decades, and contemporary activists are charting important new directions. So I end my comment with this activism and hopes that it offers for what we need now, which in my view are new ways to think about intersex and gender binaries. And as I wrap up, I should also mention that I fundraised and worked a lot with Duke University Press to ensure that the book is free. So you can download chapters or you can download the whole PDF. And if you do want to buy a paper copy, then proceeds are going to be donated to Intersex South Africa. Also, if you're an activist who's based in Africa and you'd like a paper copy, just email me with your address and I'd be glad to send you a paper copy. So thanks again for the opportunity to be in conversation. This is also, I wanted to say, Shireen mentioned the timing with Caster Semenya's autobiography coming out. This is also Intersex Solidarity and Remembrance Day. So I feel like that's also a fitting time for us to really engage with these conversations. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. And wow, I didn't know that you had made it available for free. So that's setting a bar for all of us. Thank you very much. Jabu, I'm going to pass the mic over to you virtually.
Thank you. It's really fantastic to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to be sharing some of my thoughts. And Amanda, well done on a really excellent and much needed publication book that's affirms the immense work that intersex activists are doing in building a movement, in building so much. So really congratulations to you on this work, and also for making it available to the public and to the movements. I think just my thoughts may not be very logical or random like the book, but I'm happy to just share some of some of my kind of more ways to provoke conversation in this seminar. I think just to kick off, I think when we think about Caster Semenya, for example, and foregrounding her struggle against an immense institution like the sports world bodies, the athletics federations, etc., and the struggles, I think in that moment, we have to think about different struggles and different multi-layered struggles that come to the fore. One, that Caster Semenya deeply fights for the identity of women and the definition of women, and not the definition or identity or self-identifies as intersex. And I think that is a critical piece to how we ourselves position her in this conversation, whether we claim her as intersex or whether we claim her as a woman, which is the battle that she's had in that struggle. And I think the focus of Amanda's work is more on the medicalization and scrutiny that Caster faced and the violence that came with the intersections of race and medicalization. However, it's interesting that in this contemporary time, we are battling for the title and definition of women, be it from the medical fraternities or be it from the TERFs who are slashing away at trans identities and intersex identities. The contestation of women is no longer the seated privilege of cisgendered women. It is now the contested claim of all people who identify as women, and which is the assertion and struggle that I believe Caster Semenya is pushing. And I think the other component to that that's interesting is Amanda's book really positions wonderfully the struggles and fights for movement building. And yet when we look at the struggle of Caster, it's the lone journey of the single woman who wasn't even supported by other women's movements in the struggle for her autonomy to be a global world athlete. And so there's that singular narrative that is almost what we would say is not so much how we align as movements or how we would consider a class action. So in the case of Caster Semenya, it was a single litigation struggle for her dignity and for her victory, and not necessarily that of a class action on athletes as a whole. And I think it's something for us to deeply consider about what does it mean to be a hero as an athlete, and yet as in a single trauma fight a single battle without a movement behind you, whichever movement would ally, or align with her. So just in part, I just want to kick off with that thought around the battle of women and the battle of Casa Semenya and the battle of the body. And I think the other component to that we so well know and that's so well documented, be it in North America or in the global South, is that history of pathology of the Black body. And the book puts that out so clearly around the vulnerability and the whole intersections of medicalization and white supremacy, and how that has always been used to affirm a definition of what could be considered normal or normative. And so we are confronted in the struggle around bodily autonomy, self-determination, the struggles around the visual signs of what embodies our oppression and our resilience, right? And so these kind of visual signs that the medical world has used of exclusion, medical use of superiority of body, of normalization of body, of correct, what is a correct body, and that this kind of assertion that the world has to exist within a binary framework, that and this has largely been pushed through the medical world, that then filtered into our legal world, that now we are trying to undo in so many different ways and levels, as you can see in so many struggles, including in the USA with all the anti-trans legislation. So I think to think about those issues are quite pertinent. And the other piece that I want to touch on as well, which is when you read the book, and if you have, you will encounter the life of Sally and Sally's interconnected struggles with the liberation movement, in working towards ending apartheid, identifying, as a Jewish activist who is in the fight to end apartheid, and at the same time, the interconnecting struggles around bodily autonomy, around identity and all of these issues, but equally it intersects with a whole lot of issues that we need to tackle in this contemporary time that Sally represents, around economic hardship, isolation, mental well-being, a sense of belonging. What does love, care look like in our practice, either as activists or in our practice, in our existence? And I think her embodiment represents the things that we gloss over so easily, which is somebody died lonely. Somebody was born lonely into this world that medically violated her. And that is the experience of intersex people, is being born into this world lonely with stigma and dying into this world lonely with stigma. And I think this path of how we memorialize activists, it challenges that, because it challenges the fact that we want to always position people as they've done great work and they're heroes. And they definitely are. But we don't know as living beings how to embody the grief of that pain of trauma, of isolation, that grief of dying poor, hungry, that your body is only found several days later because you live on your own and in isolation. And that in itself, in this day, calls on political will. It calls on a new way of reframing our activism. And I'm so glad that you put that in the book. I'm so glad that you wrote about that piece of pain and grief of the life of Sally. And then just the other components that I would just say is that as much as, and maybe this is just a critical thought I would say would be challenging, is that the book is titled as Africa Intersex, but it's largely through the narrative and activism of South Africa. And I think there is a challenge in us having to think about South Africa's positionality as a strong base of activism, of deconstruct, those challenges, and how we position that in relation to the other 54 countries in the continent, and looking at those struggles, because in this contemporary time, we are struggling with a couple of things where states, for example, are willing to continue criminalizing homosexuality, but would accept a medicalized pathology to say, well, intersex people were born this way, so let's try and look at protections, where sexual orientation and gender identity is choice. And so we find ourselves in this conundrum where we have this acronym that we've become attached to as a movement called the LGBTIQ movement, and I think this is something that we have to interrogate. And I think intersex people, through so many vulnerabilities, have become attached into this movement, but it hasn't fully formed its own autonomous identity through that movement. I think it is working on that. It is a resilient movement. There are incredible leaders, but I think there are those kind of tensions that we need to interrogate further and look at, because the pathology is even being used through the politics of you look at Uganda, you look at Kenya. Kenya has successfully put in protections on intersex-born children, which is great, and yet on the other hand wants to criminalize homosexuality through new legislation. So I think the acronym itself becomes a challenge in terms of the movement struggles and how we position that. And then I would just say that when we look at two significant figures in South Africa in the archive, we talk about Simon and Cordy, who was a treason trialist in South Africa, anti-apartheid, well-known gay activist and anti-apartheid activist, and Sally Gross, an intersex activist, anti-apartheid activist, and it's so interesting and I only met Sally in the later years of my life. I think 2011 or so, I'd met Sally. And my question that I had in my mind was, why was this archive so silenced, or this kind of activism, including trans activism, so silenced during apartheid? And I know your book can't cover everything. It's not the purpose of this book, but it's maybe the next book. I think it's kind of thinking about, like, as a trans person who navigated a large part of my life as a lesbian who had transitioned, I think those struggles interplay in how we have to think about moments in our history where gay mainstream movements also contributed to the silencing of activism. So it's kind of thinking about that, and it made me think about, why is the rise of intersex movements happening now, and why was it so silenced for so long, and who did the silencing of movements? Because Sally Gross was not the first intersex activist, but was certainly the first documented intersex activist who went to a mainstream media to have her story told. And I think there's something around that, around silencing, that movement silence movements, movement silence others, and how do we kind of address that tension within movements and not try and romanticize the resilience of movements as such. And then, yeah, I would just say that in my final thoughts, I'm thinking about, like, how do we, as scholars, as activists, as visual artists, and so on, when we engage with this kind of work, how do we assist activist people, intersex bodies, move outside of the frame of just medicalization and pathology, you know, about creating work of joy, of bodies that are desirable, because that is the colonial project. The colonial to enforce was that Black bodies, Black women had to be undesirable. They had to be strictly there for labor or sex slave work or whatever. Like there was that kind of enforceability. And within the intersex narrative, we are still confining our narratives to pathology. And how do we, and even in the positive realm of saying we need to end intersectional mutilation, we are still doing that. And if you look at the appendix 3 of the book, which is wonderfully putting out the work of the African intersex movement, even within the internalization of the movement, it is working on ending the pathology. So I just want to stop there and say, these are some of my thoughts, and just to say thank you again for inviting me to provide some of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jabu. Somehow in the middle of your comments, my Zoom dropped, so I'm now sitting in Gabriel's seat. Don't know what's happened with Carleton system, but I hope that doesn't happen to you, Anne. So let me hand it over to you at this point.
Fingers crossed. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Delighted to be here. Thank you, Shireen, for situating me in relation to this group. It's always a pleasure to be able to collaborate with you and to be invited to be in conversation with the folks who gather under this rubric of not only the Institute of African Studies, but the Knowing Africa series as you've constructed it. I think it's been such an amazing success too as a Zoom genre to be able to bring people together across wide distances. So Jabu, I really appreciate the opportunity to hear your comments. And for the two of us then to be situated differently with respect to Amanda's book. For purposes of the conversation, I want to identify myself, let's say, the leading edge being my work in LGBTQ studies as a scholar, as a teacher, as an activist. And so here I am not a specialist in African studies and not a specialist in intersex studies. And I wanted to begin by saying that in order to perhaps find a way to honor or to underscore the achievement of Amanda's book in bringing those categories that are sometimes marginalized within mainstream LGBTQ studies, both the African studies and the intersex studies. The fact that you bring both of those in dialogue with one another, Amanda, in a way that is not a narrow specialist, field specialist or area specialist study, but one that has huge import for all of us. I suppose and I did not know that the Caster Semenya memoir was coming out, so I'm going to want to ask you to talk about that, Amanda, at some point. But the fact that Caster Semenya has been such a figure globally, and indeed I was very struck, Jabu, by your comments about the individual and the collective and the sort of different individuals that we have in this book who have varying degrees of knownness, where although also where to be known or to be visible is not always a good thing. There's something interesting to me about that. So I wanted to do this as a Q&A, partly because I'm not an expert and also because I just wanted to use our time to try to draw Amanda out on some of the things that interest me. And I will, as Shireen suggested, now be also referring a bit to Jabu's really interesting remarks. And Amanda, you did such a great job of summarizing your own book. That's why it's good to have this book series begin with the author, him, her, themselves. And so I want to there's 3, maybe 4 areas I would hope to be able to focus on. One is the work of memorializing Sally Gross that Jabu's also mentioned, which I found to be a really moving aspect of the book. I also would like to ask you about method. So I really appreciated that you flagged citational chains and the work of, what do you call it? I call it like spectacle. The objectifying scrutiny. I have a bunch of questions about method that probably have to do with my interest in archives and also affect. Thirdly, a chance to kind of dwell a bit on the question of Caster Semenya, particularly in this moment. And then finally, if there's time, I think this book has really huge significance for thinking about the medical industrial complex and science more generally. And I'm very interested in what's happening right now in North America under the rubric of healing justice and different understandings of the significance of critiques of the medical industrial complex. So I'll try to get to each of those, but first, just your book is so generous. I mean, even as we've remarked, your desire to keep it open access, which I really appreciate because I'm constantly getting emails from scholars around the world who would love to read my work but can't afford it. So I think that's brilliant what you've done. And it is, as I said, a very moving book, but the tone is also very, very thorough and scholarly. It was present in the way you described it. It's restrained, it's humble, and yet it is so powerful. For me, for example, as a reader who did not know Sally Gross personally in the way that you did, and who didn't know her work except through this book, and it's a brilliant effort to give her the story that she deserves in a range of ways. Again, Jabu, just that phrase of yours of being born or living alone and then dying alone. Amanda, I just want you to give you an opportunity to say more about what it means for you to have aimed to bring this story forward and some of the challenges indeed of this tension around the individual and the collective. For example, I do want to flag my interest in, for example, histories of the ANC, and then also the intersections with the really important LGBTQ activisms. At this moment, I think it's really loaded but important to talk about Jewish activists and that tradition within the South Africa's anti-apartheid movement because of diasporic populations in South Africa, where that leads people, how Sally seems to have converted to Catholicism and then been booted from the church. So this is someone who sought collectivity and often couldn't find it. And I think too of other, this is also true in trans activism's kind of people who are shaped by oppression and often can be difficult people, eccentric people, lonely people. You know, what it means to do justice to their lives is not necessarily a heroic narrative, but a different kind of one. And again, I just want to, I'll stop there and just give you a chance to say a bit about sort of what lies between the lines or affectively inside of this very powerful chapter of the book.
Thank you so much, Anne, and also to Jabu for these really moving and provocative comments. I mean, I found myself getting goosebumps a number of times during both of your interventions. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with both of you here to speak to your question. And I think that, you know, part of what motivated me, as I talked about, is the tragedy of Sally's death that Jabu so eloquently described, right? You know, in the way that, as you did, Anne, I kind of flagged that she was born and died lonely and with stigma, right? And what that meant, I think, and what that means about Sally as part of a whole context of the kinds of stigma that folks face around being intersex and different kinds of interventions is really something that, in addition to the photos that I described, was very haunting to me. And so I think that I've always been someone who's motivated by my politics and feelings in, you know, where I want to go with different kinds of work. And if anything, I felt a strong sense of responsibility to Sally, you know, after her death, to really follow up on conversations that we'd been having about work that she'd been doing. And, you know, I think part of what was so also sad to me, but important about Sally's work is that while it wasn't recognized in the way that it should have been, like Sally, when she passed and people started, you know, figuring out obituaries and sort of talking about her, so many people talked about the ways that she had this global impact, but I don't think that she was recognized or celebrated in the way that she should have been. So I think for me, I just felt a strong sense of responsibility to be a small part of that conversation of really this kind of memorializing activists, as Jabu said, but then thinking about what this means, right? Like what this tells us. I think, you know, where we go with all of those feelings. So I feel like that sense of collectivity that Sally sought and that organizations like Intersex South Africa and IRANTI are really creating is something that also can't be underestimated. There's the great, you know, legal work, there's working with doctors, you know, there's working with communities, and I think that's all really important. But another big part of what activists are doing and what Sally did is creating connections, creating sort of an antidote to that isolation that's really forced on people. So what does it mean to think about alliances that can happen, you know, among folks who identify as intersex, including among, you know, between folks who may identify as trans or intersex or both. You know, what does it mean to think about alliance building as sort of a response to some of the enforced loneliness or the, you know, intentional isolation that I think medicine brings? Was really, it was moving to me to see like how much connection and community is being built. And I don't want to romanticize it. I think that Jabu provides us really with an important corrective to that, you know, to say, this is not without tensions, right? These kinds of tensions that occur, you know, between the you know, the lesbian and gay kind of mainstream dominance and trans and intersex community, for example, or the dominance of South Africa in a lot of these dialogues that are trying to be, you know, collaborative in African contexts, or the kind of, you know, what does it mean for me, someone from the global north, to talk about activism that's happening in the global south? I think all of these power differentials and tensions need to be part of the conversation. So I think that was probably part of like what was really difficult, and maybe part of what took me so long to write the book too, is because I wanted to navigate those waters in ways that would be as respectful as possible. And that's always hard. I also felt really compelled by, you know, what activists are saying now, which is there's a, you know, I would find this, you know, written out. There's a need for research. We're calling for research, you know, that we need to document these histories. We also need to have sources that can be used to make these arguments to those, you know, who have different kinds of legislative or medical power, for example. So I think thinking about how the book could be useful was something that really occupied me a lot. Not that I was less interested in, let me just, you know, do this for my own purposes, but like, how would this be, is there a way that this could be helpful, and how could I structure the book around those kinds of objectives?
And could I say something about Sally? And this is a kind of just in the spirit of these personal reflections, and that I did want to say that Sally's really, really important to my thinking, because she was the first person who told me when I gave a talk on, I don't know, something like the history of the equality clause. She was the one who pointed out to me the invisible binary running through my work, and challenged me, in the early 2000s to think in a much more expansive way about gender, which I then have tried to do ever since. So for me, she was a really important inspiration. But just to throw in a word here, about her loneliness, and the sense of shame, I think, that many of us felt when she died, because we felt like we hadn't been good allies either. So I think that shame was on many of us, that learned so much from her. And I'll say this just about me, I don't speak for others, but for someone like me who learned so much from her, and cited her ever after in my talks and so on, but actually I was not there when she needed support. So I just wanted to bring that in. Take responsibility.
And I think that's so important in terms of perhaps the value of Amanda's book for thinking about histories of activism and what we want from them, and the way in which we may want to explore messier aspects of what's happened. I mean, this too is interesting in terms of what I understand to be the importance of the case, as it were, of South Africa, and the promise, for example, of the Rainbow Constitution, the way that made possible Sally's return to South Africa, and the place of intersex activism there, but also as I'm talking to activists and scholars based in South Africa now in 2023, having to deal with a legacy that's more complicated and more mixed coming out of that. So I think maybe, Amanda, this is another value to your having taken time with this project. I'm going to try to ask you one more question, and then I'll look to Shireen as to whether we open it up from there. And I can maybe put some other comments or questions in the chat. But I did want to speak to this question of method, particularly because you yourself flagged as so important these decisions you've made around exploring the notion of the citational chain, looking at your refusal to use the photographs. And here I'm going to again note this kind of tension between or fusion of the affective and let's say method, or a search for uncovering these horrific untruths. So I'm going to just note some of you use the term nagging, and I love nagging doubt as a provocation for a project. It's often been the case for me where something nags at you, it won't go away, but you don't quite know what to do with it or how to work with it. And I think that is often a very important methodological premise. But we also hear you mentioned it in your remarks, haunting, right? You borrow from Avery Gordon. The question of haunting emerges early on. It's very present in your epilogue. So we could say you're haunted by the photographs. I mean, we're talking also about a kind of haunting by Sally's death in a state of solitude or isolation. And so to me, those affects are very important ones for the work we do as activists and scholars. There's also a kind of anger, sometimes in the flatness of you just laying out these citational chains. I mean, it's brilliant, what you do with that MA thesis of Grace's, to just lay it on the table and demand, in a sense, a kind of acknowledgement or recognition of the damage done through the practice of citation. And then, as you mentioned, the range of archives, we could talk about social media. There's just so much that's very rich about the method of this book, and the layering of a kind of affective power with also an epistemic power that I find really exemplary, and I hope others will pick up this book in order to think about those things. Actually, one other thing about citational chains, just quickly, is this question of the politics of citation has also been very relevant within, for example, Black feminisms, women of color feminisms. So I think of Sarah Ahmed, I think of the work of Catherine McKittrick, where there's the Billy Ray Belcourt's work, who, Shireen, you were mentioning, the building of citational practices to produce alternative forms of knowledge is very powerful right now. And I found myself thinking about the way your notion of the bad version of the citational chain might meet up with other forms of citational practice that could build knowledge differently.
Yes, thank you so much, Anne. And I really appreciate the way you're thinking about affect and method together, which totally makes sense because I'm so inspired by your work that does a lot of that, connecting and thinking about their inseparability in some ways. And I hadn't, I had thought about I've thought about the grief, that Jabu really eloquently described. That's something that's been really present for me. The nagging is something that I kind of came to with the way that nagging and haunting kind of came together is something that really was propelling this. I didn't realize that the anger comes through, and I love that you called that out because that's so strong there, right? Like, I mean, I think that really was, for me, the anger about this going on for so many decades and centuries, about the extreme violence and how to work with that anger in a way that would then call out the violence that's been there in a way that would be, I don't know, useful or, productive to confronting it, that isn't just like, I'm angry, but is really something that then can be channeled into a strong critique, is something that I thought a lot about. I didn't think about it through the lens of anger. So that's really provocative for me, because I think, as you said, Anne, the kind of layering of affective and epistemic power are really critical to this. And, a lot of the work that I think activists do is really about changing hearts and minds, right? It's not just about changing laws, it's about confronting shame and stigma, which is really, an affective project as much as it is kind of a logistical one in some ways. Or maybe you disagree. I see you kind of looking. I don't know how you feel about it, but that's interesting for me to consider. I'll say one more thing, which is just about the politics of citation. I think that's a really interesting point of comparison, and I certainly think a lot with Black feminisms. I also was thinking about the ways that someone brought this to my attention recently, the ways that someone like Saadia Hartman chooses to embrace photos as like a space for thinking about joy, and the way that I was kind of rejecting photos is an interesting counterpoint. And I think those are different kinds of contexts, and I think about the ways that they've been reclaimed, and photography as a field or as a kind of approach, a methodology or a method is really important. I think that's not something that I came to the project thinking about, but it was especially through the hauntingness of these photos, and then later through the work that Jabu and others are doing that really are very visual, right? They're about capturing images and video that speak back to the kind of objectifying representation that's just been the dominant discourse for so long. I don't know, you seemed like you had thoughts, Anne, so I want to defer to you.
No, just listening with interest. And yeah, you're right that I think it doesn't have to be an either or, but you're right that the photographs or your decision not to use them stands alongside of various kinds of creative work with photographs, so that could produce something different. You mentioned Hartman's work. Tina Campt is another person who's actually worked in South African archives and has reproduced images. Zanelli Maholi's work, obviously, which is very widely known on the global stage for alternative forms of visibility. So I don't think it's all one thing, but in fact, your very strong choice to not reproduce images is very important. I would also place it alongside of discussions within Indigenous studies and Indigenous arts in Canada around, again, the violent use of imaging to be able to create archives that are colonial, and the undoing of those practices is a very live enterprise in Canada and the Americas today. I think
I wonder if Jabu wanted to come in on this discussion at all at this point.
Well, this is really great. Maybe just the one thought I had around the issue is that around photography is that the whole idea around ending intersex genital mutilation is already so aptly visually descriptive in the minds that doesn't need, it doesn't need an actual object called a photograph in that sense. So I think there's something around the medical portraiture of bodies that has impacted on our framing of bodies in that sense, and how, even when if you say the word trans bodies, the first thing people would want to talk about is your genitals, for example. So I think it's for me, the photograph is the physical evidence of something, but it's already being implanted prior to that, and I think it's perhaps a good thing not to be in that way, because when we think about how photographs have been used, you think go right back to thinking about how, for example, something as vile as lynching in America and the travel of postcards in order to instill fear within a Black population of America was through the photographs. And and so I think many intersex people will talk about how cameras have been used in whether when you're under anesthetic, for example, etc. And if you go to the WPATH conferences, doctors will proudly display posters of their surgeries without the consent of people don't even know that could even be their bodies, So these photographs have been violently used in the medical fraternity. And so, for example, as a trans person, when I go for any surgery and I'm under anesthetic, I clearly sign that doctors have no consent at all for any cameras in, whether it's taking away a mole on my neck or dentistry. That has nothing to do with transness, but the mere fact that I disclose that I'm trans already opens me up to vulnerability. So I think it's really thinking about that instrument, the weaponry of photography, and how it's been instrumentalized in many ways. Thanks.
We've got 10 minutes before Anne needs to leave. So I wonder if we should open this up to see if there are any questions from people who are on the Zoom. And, if you raise your hand, I think I will see you. I'm now using Gabriel's not Mac, and I'm completely unsure how to use a not Mac. So please do raise your hands if you have a comment or a question or any kind of intervention you want to make. If not, then Anne, maybe you do want to ask your last question, seeing as...
Well, I'll keep it quick and just say we can build off of what we've just, the discussion of Sally Gross, the discussion of method, to then turn to this question of Caster Semenya. And Amanda, what I might want to say now about the plethora of representation in and around Castor. Very interesting that she now produces a memoir. I want to go see it. But you talk a lot in your chapter about her use of social media also to self-represent. So I think you allow for that possibility. But I wonder if you could just give us a bit of the behind the scenes, even of how you have had to grapple with a range of sources, including also actually many of the, my friends who work in queer South African studies. So, Neville Hode, Brenna Munro, Kaguro Macharia. There's a lot out there. So how did you carve a path through so much material, like too much material on Castor, as opposed to perhaps in the case of Sally Gross, too little? And there's even more about to come.
Yeah.
That's a great point, Anne. And it was that's actually a huge challenge that, while some communities have been really, ignored, others like Semenya have been hyper visible and over scrutinized and speak back to that. So that was a challenge, in the way that Jabu identified, there are a few activists who have stood out, like Simon Okori and Sally Gross, in the same way, like Semenya has sort of occupied this representative space. And so I think that what I wanted to focus on, because I think this was part of early conversations when Semenya came under some public scrutiny, was folks would say, oh, she doesn't say anything, she's so quiet, and they would talk about her, but not with her and not to her. And so I really wanted to find ways to highlight her views and her opinion on what she was experiencing throughout this. And social media was sort of where I ended up going. So I think that Semenya, many folks, including some of the folks that you mentioned, in queer African studies, and I think critique the way that Castor became a case study. I think that those kinds of words were used like as representative of something about intersex or something about Africa or something about this fight to determine what it means to be a woman. So my struggle was to try to figure out where she stood. Now we're getting so much more of this, right? Like, I'm really excited that this is a moment where Semenya's memoir is just coming out. I was thinking a lot about the points that Jabu made about how Semenya identifies as a woman really strongly and, is really making a case for reclaiming what it means to be a woman and taking that space, as a lot of trans and intersex women are. And I think that as well. So I think that space of I am a woman, I've been watching some of the interviews in the last week or two with Semenya. I ordered the book, but have not gotten a chance to read it yet, or didn't arrive yet for me. But that's been really striking for me to see Semenya in conversation with mainstream media saying, well, I'm a woman, and so, let's go from here, rather than really leaning into the way that she's been described by others, and the way that those conversations have happened. So I think that's been some of the most exciting interventions. And I think this is another place where trans and intersex alliances have been really important in speaking back to TERFs, as Jabu said, in thinking about what does it mean to think about a broad category of women, to use that kind of thinking to shape public discourse that so often is, manifesting in sport. That's, as it's become such a battleground for trying to figure out, like, who's leading this, who's leading these decisions, who's going to make these decisions, or how are we all involved in and complicit in these decisions?
Thank you. Still not seeing any hands. I will alert you to a point put in the chat by Belinda Dodson, the editor of the Canadian Journal of African Studies, and that's an invitation for either Jabu or Anne or anybody else who wishes to write a review of the book to please do so. Michelle, go ahead. unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you all so much, everyone. Shireen, thank you for having this, and Amanda, the book, and Jabu, your comments, and Anne, of course, your follow-up. I have a question specifically that relates to the subtitle of the book. So I was wondering, can you, Amanda, or any of you speak about any known legacies of the indigenous South African cultural perspective on intersex persons that perhaps doesn't center pathology or deviance as found with the scientific racism in medicine? Thank you.
Can I defer to you on this, Jabu? I mean, I feel like IRANTI and others have done so much work in trying to highlight like traditional medicine and how folks have historically thought about intersex. I want to see if you have any comments before I jump in.
I would say not. I'm trying to give it some thought and kind of frame it, but I know a lot of the framing, even within traditional kind of contexts, have been embedded in a kind of a pathology of, you know, where if you are born intersex, you would be considered to have been kind of a generational curse on the family, and would have to be orphaned, abandoned. So many intersex people would speak about growing up in orphanages, you know, unfortunately, even in processes of natural birth where one would think that midwifery would be progressive, we have documented records of midwives twisting the necks of intersex-born children and killing them at birth. So there's quite a darkness around the even the cultural framing of intersex identities. And of course, many people would say that long before medical categorization, etc., you know, and these enforcements of the International Classification of Diseases that brought in this development of sex disorder descriptions, intersex was just considered as part of a spectrum of sex characteristics. But perhaps, Anne, I see you've posted something you might want to add.
Oh, it was really just in relation to the discussion in general, but I do think this is a place where perhaps this is this ongoing conversation, Shireen, that you and I think have had, which is my dream for these modes of conversation between, let's say, pre-contact or pre-colonial African studies and different ways of understanding gender, understanding social arrangements, and then ways of understanding pre-colonial, pre-contact formations in the Americas. I would love that conversation to be happening, and there's sort of important work to be done in both cases. It does involve sometimes getting past what have been romanticizing and actually sometimes also bad citational chains, as it turns out, for constructions of what indigeneity is or was. And so trying to approach the archive in kind of new ways is, I think, happening in a range of different places, but still more to come in trying to think different understandings of gender, different understandings of what things like disease, health, and healing are. For me, that's another really exciting area for both activist work and scholarly work. That's sort of a general answer, Michelle, to your question.
Yeah.
But
no, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I agree, like maybe more conversations to be had on that for sure. Thank you all.
It's a good it's a good concluding comment as well, as it turns out, because it seems like, you know, as Anne says, you know, one way in which we can begin to break down both romanticism, but also take into account the kind of really complex issues you raised, Jabu. It's quite bravely the contestations among those of us who think of ourselves as allies, right? Which we also tend to romanticize at times, and the kind of investments we have in figures like Castor, you know, which also turn her into a kind of a cardboard cutout figure, right? We're also complicit in doing that, because some part of us perhaps doesn't want to also confront the aspects of her self-understanding and self-presentation, which is entirely entitled to, but which may not also sit so easily with some of our more radical ambitions. And so, you know, what I think this is a really difficult conversation, and I want to thank Amanda so much for expanding that, and with your wonderful and careful and attentive and kind work. I mean, you use the word generous, but I think there's such a degree of kindness in your book, anger towards the science of racism, but kindness towards all of the people who are trying to change that. So thank you very much, Amanda. We wish you many readers and many conversations. I would like to thank Jabu for checking in on us and sharing his thoughts from Kabeja. Really invaluable. Thank you very much. And also modeling what we in the seminar, you know, think of as knowledge production is a co-constitutive process. It's not, we're not studying these movements out there. We are all part of a set of struggles for change. Thank you, Anne, for popping in from downstairs and for being part of this amazing conversation, for your contributions. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Next week, the post-colonial university is the subject of our discussion, but you'll get all of those notices. And thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Go well. See you next week.
Thank you, Jabu and Anne. Thank you so much. Thank you, Shireen.
Thank you. This technology
Thank you,
was a bit of a shock to me. It hasn't happened before. I don't know, Gabriel, what happened there, but the whole Zoom platform collapsed on my computer.